We're going to find that rather difficult.
Hal, I won't argue with you anymore. Open the doors.
Dave, this conversation can serve no purpose anymore.
Hey, hello, and if you're new here, welcome to my channel. And as you can see from the title, today we're talking about 2001 A Space Odyssey, and in particular, we're going to take a look at the HAL 9000, the supercomputer that we meet on board the Discovery 1 ship. But there has always been a question of whether or not HAL is infallible, or if HAL can make mistakes, or indeed, if HAL can lie. And can HAL experience emotions? Because later on in the film, that may actually be a question. So let's take a look at the HAL 9000. Now, when we first are introduced to HAL, it's in this scene aboard the Discovery 1, in which we see our astronauts, Dave Bowman and Frank Poole, eating while they are watching a BBC news program about their mission, in which we find out the HAL 9000 is on board with 5 crew members, 3 of which are hibernating for the trip, the other 2 being Dave and Frank. Then the interviewer actually talks to HAL, calling him the brain and central nervous system of the ship, asking HAL if he ever has a lack of confidence at having such huge responsibility. And HAL answers that the 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made, and says they've never made a mistake or distorted information. But knowing what happens later, I have to ask, does HAL actually believe what he's saying here? And side note, Frank says that they just think of HAL as the 6th member of the crew, so the astronauts aren't really expecting anything to go wrong. Also, Dave says if HAL sounds like he has emotions, it may just be because he is programmed that way, so it will be easier for humans to interact with him. But the question of emotions will come back later. And right after Frank gets a birthday message from his parents, we get this rather famous scene of Frank playing chess with HAL. But side note, IBM scientists had apparently been working on automated chess engines ever since the 1950s. And of course, IBM famously shows up reflected on Dave's face inside a pod ship, as well as HAL's name being exactly 1 letter removed from the letters IBM. But in the scene, we see Frank say queen takes pawn. After a couple more moves, HAL tells Frank that he missed it, and that HAL can now apparently win by moving queen to bishop 3, and will checkmate Frank. Except that's incorrect. The correct move for HAL should have been queen to bishop 6. So when Frank quits, it was sort of because HAL made a mistake, something he wasn't supposed to do. Or was HAL being purposely deceitful here? In a very odd scene in which Dave is showing some of his artwork to HAL, as if a computer would have some appreciation of art, it's a bit strange. But then HAL expresses suspicion that there are some odd things about the mission. Is HAL expressing doubt? It sounds to me like HAL might be starting to put his thoughts and doubts together into sort of an emotional response, though again, it could be that he is programmed to do that. Immediately after this, HAL informs Dave that a piece of equipment is malfunctioning and will completely fail within 72 hours. So the astronauts will have to go out and fix it. But as we find out later, There is no equipment malfunction. So, is HAL lying? And why? After the astronauts go into one of the pod ships to fix the problem, we find out that there's not actually anything wrong with the equipment. So Hal, who is supposed to be infallible, was wrong. Dave and Frank again question Hal, asking if he's ever made an error, to which Hal replies that the 9000 series has a perfect operational record. After this, Dave and Frank, now concerned that Hal is malfunctioning, go into a pod ship to have what they think is a private conversation, but they don't realize that Hal can lip read what they're saying. Both of the astronauts have a bad feeling, though, and discuss possibly having to disconnect Hal. When Frank goes outside again with the piece of equipment, he is seemingly attacked by a pod ship, which, with Hal's eye on it, appears to be under Hal's control, and Frank's air hose is pulled out, and Frank dies. So, if Hal has done this to defend himself from probable shutdown and disconnection, then apparently he has lashed out here and attacked Frank out of anger or frustration or just self preservation or being scared. But this seems like confirmation of Hal feeling emotions to me. It seems like he has evolved from his basic programming to have a sense of self preservation. I can't help but think of the Eight Men scenes when they are fighting for control of a waterhole in the earlier part of the film. Dave does go out to retrieve Frank's body and amazingly does get him. But when Dave gets back to the ship, he gets an unwelcome surprise as Hal refuses to let him back in the ship. Dave has to open the pod bay door himself and make a daring re-entry into the ship. After putting on an emergency green helmet, Dave makes his way to Hal's logic memory center, or to Hal's brain, as Hal tells him everything is going to be okay and that he feels much better. An odd thing for a computer to say, but Dave ignores him and continues to go inside. Once inside the memory area, Dave proceeds to start shutting down Hal's memory, as Hal keeps telling him to stop, his voice slowing down. And in what to me is one of the most striking scenes, Hal tells Dave that he's afraid. That's most definitely an emotion, and in fact, you could argue it is one of the earliest emotions that humans developed in the dawn of man, perhaps tied to our fight or flight response. Again, Hal tells us he can feel his mind going. He says it several times, as if to emphasize he now has feelings. And I think this last scene with Hal is, to me anyway, proof that Hal has started to develop at least the earliest sort of emotional responses, such as fear. So, to sum up, today we took a look at the HAL 9000 supercomputer from 2001 A Space Odyssey. And I think one of the most important points about HAL is set up in the first scene we meet him, where he's interviewed for the BBC, when the interviewer calls HAL the brain and central nervous system of the ship, in effect describing a system that can think, feel, and evolve, which I think HAL does, because that's what a brain and nervous system do over time. They evolve. Of course, a central theme in the film. But does Hal make mistakes? He's supposed to be infallible, but when he tells the astronauts that a piece of equipment is malfunctioning, when it clearly isn't, it seems Hal is making a mistake. Now, in the chess game with Frank, Hal tells Frank that he'll be in checkmate, but that isn't completely correct. So there's a bit of deceit or even bravado from Hal. It seems so. But more importantly, when Dave goes to shut down Hal, Hal clearly says he is afraid and repeats the word feel to emphasize, I think, that he has developed emotions, perhaps the earliest form of emotions in a film that is literally about evolution. Well, that's my new video all about the HAL 9000 computer from 2001 A Space Odyssey. I hope you liked it. I should be back next week at my usual time with a new video. Also, let me say thank you to my awesome comments section. I always like to hear what you have to say. Oh, and YouTube does now have something called a hype button on their mobile app, and if you click it, it does help out smaller channels like mine. And of course, it always helps if you do hit that subscribe button and like the video. But either way, my name is Shim. Thank you for spending time with me, and have a great day.